Hi, it's Slater. Hey, watch where you're flying that thing, huh? This video is about learning to fly Jagwings, the best walk-along glider designed to start with. You levitate and control them by surfing on a wave of air. Jagwings are great for groups of pilots, like schools, because they're stable and reliable. And they're great for flying even inside small house spaces. With a simple modification, just 2 folds at the wingtips, Jagwings become incredibly acrobatic. Although Jagwings are not the most efficient design, they're efficient enough that you can learn to fly with only your hands diverting the air, like magic. We'll also delve a bit into the science of how walk-along gliders fly, using the same effect that large birds and hang gliders use to stay in the air. Before we start flying, let's tip our hat to the Jagwing's inventor. Michael Thompson designed the Jagwing when he was an engineering student. Although Mike's Jagwing design is simple, check out his many other amazing walk-along glider creations on his YouTube channel, Glider Guider 1. Some of them are quite unworldly. There's more about Mike's work on the linked video about how to build the Jagwing. Before you even handle a glider, be aware that they are very delicate. Nervous or excited, unaware hands will wreck the shape needed to fly in seconds. Always be aware of the sensation of how much pressure your fingers are pressing with. You'll need very still air to fly in. Usually that means inside, away from evil vents. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum would seem like the perfect place to fly, right? Eventually, it was, but we had to find a hallway where the vents were not blasting air. In schools, sometimes only the hallways are still enough to fly in. Even in calm space, flying close to moving people is impossible because of air currents. Spread out. It's always too windy to fly outside when the sun shines, but sometimes around sunrise and sunset, it's calm enough for outdoor flight, or when it's very overcast or foggy. When you start, it's best to have a big piece of cardboard, like half a pizza box, to deflect the air. In a pinch, you can use a big book or something, but it'll be harder to learn. The landing gear, which is also the necessary front weight, needs to be bent down 90 degrees. So make sure the back flap, called the elevon, is bent up and the landing gear is down. When you move the glider into position on the board, pick it up. Don't slide it, because the glider rubbing against the board causes static cling. This is an extreme case of static cling, but even if it's not this bad, it can cause problems when you're trying to take off from the board. You see static cling mostly in dry weather and with air conditioning. It's pretty easy to work around, avoid, or discharge static electricity if it happens. That's the subject of a separate linked video. If I could be there, we would walk side by side, both of us holding the board, but me actually controlling it for the first few steps. You would get a feel of flying quickly. The board angle, speed, glider position relative to the board, committed to muscle memory. But learning just by words and sight is going to take longer. Hang in there, practice, and eventually flying will be as easy as riding a bicycle. If you walk forward with the board flat, it just slices through the air, and the glider falls off the back. But if you walk with the board slanted, a wave of air is deflected up. So keep the board slanted, unless you want to land. At first, I suggest just a little slant, but still enough to get lift. Make short hops at first, and try to get a sense of how fast the glider flies, so you can keep it flying right about here, within the half of the board closest to you. Go fast enough so the glider does not fly at the front of the board, because there it speeds up and goes down. It's very common for beginners to lose altitude, so pilots are bent over. Beginners instinctively lower the board when the glider goes down, but that just makes it worse. This is exaggerated, but do not lower the board. It just sucks the glider down. However, you can actually gain altitude quite dramatically. What happens if you walk so fast that the glider blows over the top? Notice that the glider goes higher before going over. If you raise the board when the glider goes up, then you gain altitude instead of going over. It's a balancing act, and it takes lots of practice. To steer, tip the left or the right of your board. It's common for beginners to follow the glider when it turns left or right, but you tell the glider where to go, not the other way around. With practice, you'll be able to fly with the board held almost vertically, like a wall. As you get better with walk-along gliders, it's fun to try to land on tables. It's sort of analogous to hang glider pilots who try to land on a target. Depending on how big the target is, it's not so easy. You can make your glider much more responsive to tight turning by folding vertical flaps on the wingtips. The flaps can be anywhere from the width of the landing gear to double the width. How wide is not so important, as long as they're the same on both sides, symmetrical in other words, and the fold should be parallel to the edge. With that simple modification, you can fly in some very small spaces. Then the biggest challenge becomes working through your own turbulence. You want to race? In Thailand, there's a whole sport of relay races and obstacle courses. You can mark on foam gliders, but be gentle. It's really easy to rip the foam. Transport for thin foam gliders is treacherous, unless you stick them in a book or tablet or something. Take a look at the angle of the back bend, called the elevon, because the book will flatten it, and you'll have to rebend it, or else your glider will dive. So you want to fly just using your hands like magic. I hope you like a challenge. Unlike a big board, hands barely create enough updraft to keep the glider up. This takes lots of practice. You will not get it in one day. I bend the front weight forward a bit for hands-only flying. This shifts the center of gravity, or balance point, of the glider forward. For a smooth launch, I hold very gently from the back, tip the front down slightly to avoid stalling, push and release at flight speed. I launch high, stiff-arming, and have my other hand up and ready before the glider drops too much. Notice that I aim my fingers toward the back edge. When my fingers get ahead of the sweet spot, then the front of the glider lurches up and the glider stalls and then dives. On the other hand, when my fingers get above or behind the sweet spot, then the upward air hits the back too much and the glider dips and really speeds up. You'll have to constantly micro-readjust to stay within a couple of millimeters of the sweet spot. Slow your hands down if the glider starts to tip up and stall. Speed your hands up if the glider dips and speeds up. I fly the glider above my eye level so I can see if my hands are ahead or behind the sweet spot. Young people whose hands have not yet reached full size have developed ingenious strategies to compensate by using their head or indeed their whole body. Steering is slightly shifting your hands to the right or left. I'm shifting my hands a little this way so the glider turns this way. Hands-only flying is not as easy as it looks. It takes lots of practice. Unpowered hang glider pilots don't just glide down. They can fly higher than the takeoff altitude. and stay in the air for hours. Big birds, not Big Bird, big birds soar in the air effortlessly, hardly needing to flap their wings. The birds and pilots stay up in two ways: thermals and ridge lift. Thermals are hot air rising. Imagine this. It was a hot summer day, but now the sun is almost setting, so the air is calm enough to fly gliders outside. We start flying in an area where the ground is somewhat dark, so it absorbs sunlight more efficiently than the surrounding cool areas. The ground is still warm, and it warms the air above it. Warmer air rises. Suddenly, the glider is up, and away on a thermal. By the way, would you like to actually see a big thermal? You do all the time. On sunny summer days, the puffy cumulus clouds are thermals. In the part that gets high enough, the reduced air pressure and lower temperature cause the moisture to condense into tiny visible droplets of fog. Another way to stay up is ridge lift. Birds and hang glider pilots can travel for hundreds of miles along mountain ridges. Wind hits the mountains and is deflected up. Rarely, if there's just a very gentle movement of air, you might be able to face the slow wind and fly a glider even though you're standing still.
Wow, that is so...
Here my friend Wayne is standing still, flying, using the gentle ventilation in a tunnel. Walkalong gliders usually use an odd variation of ridge lift. Odd because we move the mountains, so to speak, and create relative or apparent wind. Outside, wind makes this pinwheel go round, but even inside, in still air, just by walking or waving, relative or apparent wind turns it. So mostly, we use relative wind to fly walk-along gliders. As you fly walk-along gliders, you become hypersensitive to even small patches of air turbulence. Turbulence is an invisible storm of chaos, but sometimes you can see turbulence. Notice the way these fuzzy things are going up, down, and every which way. And here's a thin shaft of sunlight illuminating the dust from a floor mat that I disturbed. It can be a fun challenge to work through turbulence, something hang glider and other pilots do all the time. Grant Sanderson, on his 3 Blue 1 Brown channel, has done a stellar job of exploring turbulence visually, verbally, and mathematically. I've put a link here and in the description. Brian Reed did some CAD flow analysis of the deflecting board. Notice that it's relatively smooth flow in front where the glider surfs, but a knot of turbulence forms behind the board. This pilot is assembling his hang glider. These bent rods create an efficient curve on the front edge called camber. Now don't try this until you're comfortable at flying, but if you put a very gentle downward curve on the smaller points by squeezing and bending, then the glider becomes a little more efficient. Do not bend the big middle point though. You can probably snip a little bit of front weight off. Baby bugs and the bigger mama bugs look like hang gliders, and they're amazingly efficient. I can fly a baby bug with just one hand, but these advanced gliders are more complex to build. If you've built and learned to fly Jagwing gliders, then you might be interested in more challenging designs covered in other linked videos.